We're going to talk about the Mount Olivet Discourse, the teachings, the sermon, or whatever you want to call it, that Yeshua did on the Mount of Olives.
Huh? The Sermon on the Mount. That's what some people call it.
No, it's not the Sermon on the Mount. No, no, that's not it. This is the one after he talks.
This is the Olivet Discourse.
Yes. Yeah, that's not the Sermon on the Mount.
Well, it's just a different mount.
Okay, so we go.
That's what you do because he's going to make sure you don't get it. You say that, Brother Chuck. We have to keep Hannah from getting her cart before the horse.
They better sit down.
Yeah. So I started the last week before last when I started this. I started out with talking about how it was in the days of Noah. And as I started preparing for this lesson, I realized I should have started at the beginning of Matthew 24 because we have several things going on in this chapter that we really need to discuss. And so, I mean, it'll be okay. But yeah, it's just like I needed to have done this a little bit differently. But anyway, so while all of Matthew 24 is prophetic, there's a good portion of it that has already happened, okay? The entire chapter is not about the day of the Lord or the end of days, as a lot of people try to make it out and try to make it fit into this end times prophetic scenario. We understand that prophecy runs in cycles, and what is true for one time can be true for another time. But we have to read in context here what the disciples are asking Yeshua and his responses to those questions. But before we get started really diving into this, I'm going to preface it with a Hebrew lesson that I learned this week. I'm taking a Hebrew class with Rabbi Eric on Facebook, and he's got like 6 people, and he's doing a beginner's Hebrew class. But he shared something this week that to me really kind of ties in to all of this, and it really resonated with me. And so I wanted to share that with you. Part of this we will have discussed before, but the rest of it I think will help us see as we get into prophecy how Hebrew wording and things that may seem like fantastic or hyperbole or however you want to call it, you know, how this is used in the Hebrew language. So we've seen this before where we've got the menorah, and the first 7 words of Genesis can fit across the stems of the menorah. And when you do that, of course you have at the Aleph and the Tav in the very middle of it at the Ner Panim, which is the face, basically is how it's called. The showcases the presence of God, so to speak. But when we read the Hebrew, the actual translation of it says, "In beginnings, created Elohim the heavens and the earth." Now, in Hebrew, in beginnings doesn't just mean the beginning of creation, okay? But it means the beginning of everything within that creation, okay? So when he speaks the universe into existence, it's not like this slow progressive thing that took eons and eons and eons to come together. That's not how that works. Now, Hebrew verbs don't have past, present, or future tenses. It only has perfect and imperfect. So our verbs and their tenses tell you when an action happened. I run, present. I ran, past. I will run, future. Okay? It does it in linear time. But it's not so much what we do, but when we do it that brings our language together. Hebrew's verbs are related to actions and when they are completed. So it doesn't matter when they happen, only if they're finished or unfinished. Okay? A perfect tense in Hebrew is a completed action, and an imperfect tense is an incomplete action. And they can either be past, present, or future, either one. It just depends on the context of the sentence that you're using. So the word for created, bara, here, is a perfect tense. It is completed. That means everything within creation was completed when God spoke it into existence at that very moment. Okay? But now, et adds a special layer of meaning to this stuff. Et is an undefined article. So when I say an undefined article, think of the English word the. The has no definition. It just points to something, a pool, the yard, your doofus next door neighbor, whatever. But now...
I don't live next door to you.
Oh, goodness. But now, et, while it's undefined, most of the time means everything that is, everything that was, and everything that will be. Okay? So, when it says Elohim created the heavens, it means everything within those heavens, past, present, and future. When he created the earth, everything within the earth, past, present, and future, the whole entirety of that creation. It means everything.
Right, so he makes a statement, and then it goes into how he done it.
How he does it, that's right. So, again, we have seen that this Yeshua calls himself the Aleph and the Tav. We know that the menorah is the eternal light. It's like the tree of life. It's representative of God and his light. And all of the stems point towards that middle stem. So everything there points to Yeshua. And as long as the temple stood, the rabbis tell us that this center light never ran out of oil. The other lamps would run out of oil, but the center lamp never did. But about 40 years before the destruction of the temple, so we know when that was, when Yeshua was crucified, okay? The rabbis says this, during the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the lot for the Lord did not come up in the right hand, and that was the lot for the goats, on Yom Kippur. They said that if the lot fell on the right hand, God accepted the sacrifice, but if it fell in the left, there was going to be sorrow and tribulation amongst the nation. But from that time, the lot never fell in the right hand till the destruction of the temple. Nor did the crimson color strap become white, nor did the westernmost lamp shine. And the westernmost lamp was that center lamp right there, that center stem. So when Yeshua died and rose again, he was the embodiment of all of this. And this does connect to our prophecies that we find in the Revelation, because that's where Yeshua is described as the brightest of lights shining amongst the 7 lampstands. Okay?
In the midst of
So when we read the first verse of Genesis, I have always read it like, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then we go to the second verse, and the earth was void and without form. It's kind of like an incomplete thing, okay? And as I just said, we're thinking in Western linear terms when we do that, and Hebrew is a pictorial language. We know this from Paleo-Hebrew, where every letter is represented by a picture, and that's the way it is even to this day, okay? So, in English, we have tons of words, Okay? We can have a round object that's a ball, and we know that's a ball, or some close to a ball. Okay? We can have a round object that's a sphere, but it's not a ball. Okay? We can have a globe, which is a round object, but it's not a ball or a sphere. So we have different words for everything. There's so many words. Hebrew is not like that. It is exactly the opposite. It uses one word to talk about a multitude of things that can relate to that word. So when the word aretz is used here, it means not just the earth. It doesn't mean just the ground. It doesn't mean just the dirt on top of the earth or the dirt below. It doesn't, what we till, what we farm, the land that we occupy. It means all of those. That one word encompasses all of that. And when you realize that, you can see that there's so much God can reveal to us through his word when we can understand the original language. I think it's probably why Hebrew is called the holy language, because it is actually the way that God reveals himself to us. That cannot be done in any other language that it's translated into. So, another thing is that, and this is kind of what brought it to me, by understanding this, we understand that God is outside of time, okay? So past, present, and future is all the same to him, right? It's how Yeshua could exist before the foundations of the world, as the Bible tells us, because it's all the same, past, present, and future. But it's also how we are known to God, because he knew us from the beginning of creation. We were there with him at the beginning, at the very beginning, because everything is past, present, and future is one thing with him. So he knew about us 6,000 years ago. To me, that just really hit me. It was like, oh my goodness, he knew me. But it also means that no matter what is happening in this world, no matter how crazy things get, no matter how we go through these prophecies and say, oh my goodness, this seems to be happening now, it doesn't matter, because God already has the ending figured out. He's already done it, from the very first of creation.
When you have a need in your life and you pray for that need, that was already settled before you were ever born. It's
Right.
already there. You just have to trust him enough to
Exactly.
say, thank you that you have met this need for me.
Exactly.
And it's coming. You may not see it today, maybe not tomorrow, but it's
Coming.
because he already knew and had it all figured out.
Exactly. So not only, what really was, since he knows the ending from the beginning of creation, it means that he wins. And so do we. I mean, I know God wins, but it's like he's already won, because it's already established. Right. Even if we don't see it in this linear time, it's already established where God is at. So, like I said, no matter what happens out there in this crazy world, no matter what kingdoms rise or fall, what happens in elections, what happens anywhere, we don't have to lose our hope, because he has created the ending already, okay? And that's my tidbit for today. I know it's a little bit off, but it also does come into play in some of this stuff. So,
People always say, "Oh, the Lord's already won, the victory's already won," but you just proved it by the word. I hear people say that, and sometimes things kind of come off cliche to me, but you just proved it with the word.
yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad you shared that.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I did. I just wanted.
That's what they say.
Okay.
So yeah.
He says.
Okay. So, what is happening before we get to the Mount of Olives? We'll go ahead and get into this now. We'll read a little bit out of, let's see, Matthew 23. I'm not going to read whole chapters. But basically, Yeshua is addressing a crowd at the temple, okay? This is not a, I love you, be sweet, by talk. This is a judgmental discourse that he is giving in the temple. He is pronouncing judgment on the religious leaders, on the people, and on the nation in Matthew 23. So he starts out saying, of course, that the rabbis and the religious leaders, they sit in the seat of Moses, so do what they say, but don't do what they do because they don't do what they do. And basically what that means is when a rabbi sat in the synagogue and read from the scroll, he sat in what was called the seat of Moses. Yeshua is saying as long as that rabbi is sitting in the seat of Moses reading from the Torah scroll, you do what he says is what he's reading from that Torah scroll. But once he gets up from that seat, he's a hypocrite. Don't do what he does. And that's because he is calling the religious leaders here in this chapter the hypocrites in everything that they are. Okay? He talks about how they put heavy burdens on people. How they are so worried about appearances and everything else. He's teaching for the very last time. This is the last time that he is going to be teaching. And he is telling them that God is going to abandon their house to them, is what he says. He's going to leave them desolate. Now, Yeshua is not just talking about Jerusalem, but he's talking about the temple in particular. This temple was the seat of power and authority in the Jewish world, okay? And the religious leaders feared that it would be taken away from them. And this kind of alludes back to Jeremiah 22. Let me go back there. Where God is speaking to the king of Judah. And he's saying, and this is what we're reading here from out of Jeremiah, is he is speaking to the last 3 kings of Israel that will ever sit on the throne, basically. He says, do what is right and just, rescue the wronged from their oppressors, do nothing wrong or violent to the stranger, orphan, or widow, don't shed innocent blood in this place. This is how Yeshua is trying to teach these people to do. You've gotten off course with Torah. You're too worried about appearances, justice and mercy and love. This is what God is about. But they don't want to hear it. So God tells these kings, if you're careful to do this, then future kings occupying David's throne will enter these palace gates riding in chariots and on horses, he, his servants, and his people. But if you will not pay attention to these words, then I swear by myself, says Adonai, that this palace or this house will become a ruin. So when Yeshua says God is going to leave your house to you, he's alluding to this passage in Jeremiah. Okay? This is where God sends Jeremiah to speak to King Josiah and his son Shallum about the destruction that God is about to rain on Jerusalem. And so this king's house is the seat of power and authority, just like the temple is the seat of power and authority. So as we listen to these words of God spoken, we can see how they can pertain to Israel in Yeshua's day. We can make this connection because they refuse to obey Torah. Their lust is for power. They have divisions and hatreds. When we were studying the Acts of the Apostles, we got into a little bit of that history of all the different factions that existed at the time. We had this one fighting against this one. You had the Sicarii that were killing everybody that didn't think like them. You had the Essenes that just went out over here and declared everybody apostates, and they were just going to stay by themselves. And then you had the Sadducees and the Pharisees and all of this. And this lust for power and these power plays was causing a lot of political division amongst the people, a lot of spiritual division amongst the people. So, And all of this was going on in the day of Josiah, and all of that contributed to the downfall of Israel in the generations after the death of King Josiah, and would be the downfall of Israel in the present time. After, it was King Josiah, his son, and then one more, and I can't think of his name. But there was never another Davidic king on the throne of Israel after the Babylonian exile. Okay? So we come into a time period here between the last books of the Bible, of the Hebrew Scriptures, and we're going into the New Testament. We've got about 300 or 400 years. They call them the silent years. But so much has happened between the death of Israel's last king. Oh, I got it right here, Zedekiah. And then when the Maccabees come on the scene. So we know from, Hanukkah and all that the Hasmoneans, known as the Maccabees, established their own monarchy in Judea following their revolt against the Seleucid dynasty. But there was a problem there. The Hasmoneans were not connected to the Davidic line, nor were they connected to the tribe of Judah, okay? The Levites had always been excluded from the monarchy. So when the Maccabees assumed the throne in order to rededicate the defiled second temple, basically a cardinal rule of God's was broken because he had already set that into place, what was to be. According to scholars within Orthodox Judaism, this also contributed to the downfall of Israel and Judea. And this internal strife, again, from Roman occupation and the violent installation, and it was a violent installation of Herod the Great. It was a war and everything else, and that when the Romans finally installed Herod on the throne. So all of that contributes because they're not following God's word. They're not doing things the way God said to do them. So when we go through these next several weeks, we have to keep, with the prophets all foretelling about things that happen in end of days and all that, we have to keep in mind this internal strife, this chaos, this spirit of Hamas within Israeli society. Keep in mind they're turning away from Torah, okay? And their hearts growing cold. So it very much pertains to things that are going on today and actually affects prophecy and how it is fulfilled. One thing about prophecy that we should understand is, and it's very true, we see this in the Bible, the rabbis say a negative prophecy doesn't necessarily have to come to pass. Okay? We see this in Nineveh. Jonah was sent to Nineveh to prophesy against Nineveh. Right. They repented and they stalled the judgment of God. Okay? This is how Maimonides explains it. He says that a negative prophecy doesn't have to come to pass, but a positive prophecy has to. And that's how you judge a prophet, by their positive prophecies. As to calamities predicted by a prophet, if, for example, he foretells the death of a certain individual or declares that in a particular year there will be famine or war and so forth, the non-fulfillment of his forecast does not disprove his prophetic character. We are not to say, see, he spoke and his prediction has not come to pass. For God is long-suffering and abounding in kindness. It may also be that those who were threatened repented and were therefore forgiven, as happened to the men in Nineveh. Possibly, too, the execution of the sentence is only deferred, as in the case of Hezekiah. But if the prophet, in the name of God, assures good fortune, declaring that a particular event would come to pass and the benefit promised has not been realized, he is unquestionably a false prophet, for no blessing decreed by the Almighty, even if promised conditionally, is ever revoked. That includes covenants and everything else. Every promise of God is never revoked. Okay? God's word is in stone, basically. So we learn...
Literally, too.
Huh?
Literally, too.
Literally, yes, literally. So basically, only when a prophet prophesies good fortune can you test him to see if he is a false prophet or not. So when we read negative prophecy about destruction and the end of days, and as we consider how things are lining up on this prophetic calendar, know that decisions we make as humans here on earth determine when those prophecies are fulfilled. We can delay a prophecy. We can speed up a prophecy. Okay? That is why we cannot use gematria or hidden Bible codes or calculating dates to determine the time that Yeshua is coming back. We can't do it because only God knows the heart of mankind, and only He knows when everything will have been fulfilled, and that's it. That who is coming because He knows the beginning. He knows the end from the beginning, right? So we can't judge mankind. We can't judge exactly where we're at on a prophetic calendar based on what we see around us. All right? We can be discerning about what's going on. We can be prepared at all times. But we should avoid at all costs saying, oh, he's coming back in 2 years. You know, it's like some of those things that we discussed the last time. Those people making definite predictions. We can't do that. So,
If anything, you can count on God's mercy.
that's right. That's right. And God will forgive a repentant heart. We could see another revival, okay? We could see another revival that takes over the country, like there was in the 1800s. You know, there's always hope.
We could, but it's doubtful.
Right, I mean, so,
I'm gonna get a bottle of water here.
okay, you go right ahead. So the previous chapters of the Synoptic Gospels introduce us to the Olivet Discourse, meaning the previous chapters in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John does not speak about this stuff, only the three Synoptic Gospels. And Luke is the only gospel that doesn't have this conversation taking place on the Mount of Olives. He has it in the hearing of his disciples only out there in the temple. In the opening lines, Matthew 24:1, Mark 13:1, and Luke 21:5, depending on the gospel, either all of the disciples are there, like they are in Matthew's gospels, some of the disciples, which is in Mark's gospel, or just out amongst the people in general, as it is in Luke's account. Yeshua's attention is directed to the temple. They're saying, look how beautiful it is. Look how remarkable it is. Look how magnificent the temple is. It just shows the glory of God. Yeshua takes that opportunity to remark. In Matthew's gospel, he says, he responded to them, amen, I tell you, not one stone will be left here on top of another. Every one will be torn down. Mark's gospel is very similar. Yeshua said to him, you see these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left upon another. Every one will be torn down. And in Luke's gospel, we have Yeshua said, as for these things you are looking at, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. Every one of them will be torn down. This is monumental. The temple was the center of Jewish life and the epicenter of Jerusalem. It was 1,550,000 square feet, and it encompassed 35 acres. We got 35 acres of building and courtyards and everything else. This thing is magnificent. The temple was covered on all sides in gold, and on sunny days, according to Josephus, it would shine like the sun itself. To say that it was breathtakingly beautiful would probably be an understatement. I cannot even imagine what that building looked like. So there are a little variations in each gospel in the disciples' questions in response to this comment from Yeshua. In Matthew, all the disciples are gathered around him and they ask two questions. One, tell us when these things will happen. 2, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now in Mark, only Peter, James, John, and Andrew are there, and their questions differ a bit. Now the first one is always, when will these things happen? But these 4 want to know what will be the sign that they're about to be fulfilled. Okay? Not necessarily about end of days isn't what they're talking about. They just want to know when this destruction is supposed to happen. Then Luke 21 has a few disciples. Again, when will these things happening? And they also want to know what will be the sign that this destruction is fixing to take place. Only in Matthew do we get the disciples asking not only about what's going to happen to the temple, but the messianic return as well. Now, Yeshua's message in these passages will contain both near prophecy and far prophecy. Prophecy that would be fulfilled in the lifetime of the present generation, and then there's prophecy that won't be fulfilled until after he returns. And often biblical prophecy is fulfilled in cycles, okay? The fact that it comes to pass in one manner does not mean it will not also come to pass in another, okay? And really, often it's both are true and both are going to happen, not it's going to be either this way or that way, okay?
History repeats itself.
Huh?
I said history repeats itself.
Right. So this is
Keep
what...
making the same mistakes, you keep getting the same outcome.
That's right. That's right. So this is what we're seeing in this section of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The first part of Yeshua's prophecy concerns events that would take place in regard to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The second part of his discourse concerns the time of his return. Both occasions are occasions of judgment, okay? But the first is a judgment against Israel herself. The second is a judgment over all the nations. Okay, we go from the least to the greatest. So today we're going to cover the events that were the near prophecies for the time of the disciples. These prophecies are the springboard for his warnings and prophecies for all the nations. And we'll cover those prophecies next week. The first thing that we see here is that right after Yeshua calls down 7 woes upon the scribes and Pharisees, right after the discourse comes after Yeshua has called down the judgment on the scribes and Pharisees with the 7 woes. The use of the word woe indicates an exclamation of grief or sorrow. So in speaking these words, Yeshua is prophesying judgment on the religious elite. Now the King James Version has 8 woes, but older manuscripts don't have verse 14 if you're reading from a King James Bible, okay? That's the verse that condemns them for taking advantage of widows and making lengthy prayers for show. Now Yeshua speaks about those sins elsewhere, but the King James Version comes from a common translation called, I think it's either the Rectus Textus or Textus Rectus. I don't know. It's one of those ways. It's those 2 words, one way or the other. What they have found out that there have been a lot of editorial stuff done to this manuscript when it's compared. They didn't have all the manuscripts that we have today back when King James wrote, when that Bible was translated into English, but they have found that they took liberties with the Greek text that is not in any earlier manuscripts.
Do you think the translators of the King James Version were influenced by fear of what King James?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely. And they also put, they're also putting in their biases,
Right.
into the text with their little additions here and there and yonder, trying to make it, they want it to read a certain way and they want you to think of it in a certain way.
That's why in the English Bible we have Jacob, one of the disciples, is called James, King James. And English is the only language that has him named James. It's actually Jacob.
Right. And that was in deference to King James.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I was shocked when I learned Spanish and I read it, the Spanish Bible, and his name was Jacob, which is Jacob.
Yeah.
Threw me off until I learned.
Right, right. So these are the 7 woes. The 7 woes against the rabbis and the Pharisees, the scribes, all of them that were in charge of the religious life of Israel. The first thing was that they shut up the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, neither entering themselves or allowing others to enter. Basically, they did not communicate God's covenant properly. Okay? Yeshua told them that they scoured the earth for one proselyte that when he was finished being taught was twice as fit for Gehenna as they were. The disciples were hypocritical. The rabbis were hypocritical, and their disciples were as hypocritical, if not more so, okay, than they were. They allowed a promise made by the temple to be negated, but not one made by the gold in the temple, which shows that their priorities were severely misplaced. They felt like the gold of the temple was more valuable than God's house itself. They were hypocrites in tithing. They made a big deal out of their small tithes of spices, down to the very nitty-gritty with their small tithes of spices, but they neglected justice and mercy and faithfulness, and that's what God called them out on. They were more concerned with outward appearances than the inward condition of their heart and their souls. They were dead on the inside, Yeshua has told them. They were whitewashed tombs full of dry bones, and they were rotten on the inside. That's how he describes them. He called them hypocrites for erecting monuments and decorating the tombs of the prophets when they were responsible for the deaths of these prophets. They were murderers just as their fathers were murderers. And because of this, these are the judgments that have come down on Israel at that time. So the judgment that Yeshua pronounces and the way that he articulates it is much in the same vein as other judgments that we see in the Bible. He uses language that makes you think of the prophets and uses terms that we can call almost apocalyptic language. Now, apocalyptic language does not mean end of the world language, okay? We've come to associate the word apocalypse with the end times, but when apocalyptic language is used, it is used to reveal or unveil something. The Greek word apocalypsis means to uncover, to disclose, to lay bare. It doesn't have anything to do with world wars and all of this kind of stuff. It's just, revealing something. In Daniel, they closed up the scrolls. Don't reveal this. So, when the scrolls are opened up and we understand them, then, this is a revealing that God is giving us. So here, this is what Yeshua is doing when he talks to his disciples in this Olivet Discourse. He's doing it in language and word choices that his audience will understand. He's alluding to prophecies, and he's alluding to statements that are made in the Bible. And these Hebrew disciples of his, when they hear these words, they know immediately what he's talking about. Because if we know that, yes, there were scrolls, but the people learned by hearing, okay? And they heard so much over and over again that they had, they could tell when they were speaking in prophetic languages. Okay. So the first part is concerning the events that take place in 70 AD. Yeshua knows that the destruction of the temple is going to occur, okay? The first thing he warns his followers about are false messiahs, telling them that many would come in his name and would lead many astray. Now, during this whole discourse, he says this 2 or 3 times. He mentions these false messiahs. Now, there have been so many recorded messianic claims since the time of Yeshua. Okay, we'll go through just a brief few of them. I won't bore you to death with them. Some of them are. We got Dositheos the Samaritan. Now, he came in the 1st century, and he tried to convince the Samaritans that he was the promised Messiah. And Origen actually wrote about this guy. Simon Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century. Now, he led the Bar Kokhba Revolution, okay, against the Roman Empire. He ruled for 3 years as a prince of a semi-independent secessionist state in Israel, actually, for 3 years. But, and many claim that he was the Messiah, including notable figures like Rabbi Akiva. And of course, Rabbi Akiva was killed by the Romans for his participation in this revolt. It is not the same Rabbi Akiva that is in The Chosen, though. They've just used his name because this rabbi lived a century later than the one that we see in The Chosen. I got confused about that. You know, when I started reading this, I'm going, okay, they've just given him a name. This is not the same learned rabbi that that everybody quotes from. So Bar Kokhba was killed at the fortress of Betar during the last stand during the Romans. And this action here solidified the Jewish diaspora. And it also solidified the schism between Judaism and Christianity. Okay, was right here. So it was at this time that the Romans renamed Israel, and they named it Syria Palestina in an attempt to break the connection of the Jews to their land. All right? When everybody starts talking about Palestine, there is no Palestine. This was a renaming by the Romans, and it was a name that referred to the Philistines, and it was a Roman way to humiliate the Jewish people, is what it was. So in the 16th century, we have Shlomo Molko, who was born to parents who were Jewish that had converted to Christianity, and he studied Kabbalah and became a mystic, and yeah, he went whack. He traveled all over Damascus and Jerusalem and declared himself a Messiah, but he was actually burned at the stake by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V for refusing to convert back to Christianity.
Ooh, Charles.
Yeah. We have Sabbatai Sevi. He was a 17th century ordained Sephardic rabbi. Now, he was the founder of the Sabbatean movement, and it is actually an influence that is still felt today, that his followers would become known as the crypto-Jews, the converts to his following. And after his death, there followed a line of men who claimed to be the Messiah after him. And then, of course, we have the latest Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who is the 7th rabbi of the Chabad Lubavitch, and some of his followers declared him Messiah. Now, it's worth noting that he did not actually take this designation on himself. It was his followers that gave that designation to him. But then we get into the Christians who thought they were Messiah. And it goes, of course, you've got Sun Myung Moon, founder of the Unification Church. You've got Ann Lee, the figure in the Shakers, who actually thought that she was the feminine perfection of God. Yeah, and considered herself Yeshua's female counterpart. We have a Frenchman who started the UFO religion real movement after he met an extraterrestrial humanoid in 1973, and he became the Messiah then. But then, of course, we have the Jim Jones, the David Koreshes, and all the others, Heaven's Gate, all those type of cults. So yes, they're all on the scene, and people follow them because they do not have a foundation of belief. So, signs of the end. Yeshua starts talking about wars and rumors of wars. There was going to be rumors of wars far off and rumors of war nearby. But he tells them that you should not be alarmed. The end was yet to come. There was going to be climatic events that would occur, like earthquakes, famines. But now this was just the beginning of what they call the birth pangs. Now, in Jewish tradition, the expression birth pangs refers to the suffering that will occur before the coming of Messiah and the final redemption. Labor is lasting a long time. Okay? All right. But This judgment on Israel is part of this birth pang process. Okay. Then we have, at that time you will be arrested and punished and put to death, and all peoples will hate you because of me. This is what he tells his disciples. And we see this from the beginning of Acts, from the first martyr's death in Stephen. We see this in Saul's persecution of the followers of Yeshua. We see this in the Sanhedrin and the temple priests, to the point to where Gamaliel tells them, would y'all just leave them alone? If they're from God, you can't stop it. If they're not from God, they won't continue. Just leave them alone. Of course, that didn't happen. But there was a concentrated effort to eradicate this growing sect of Judaism. And make no mistake, Christianity was a sect of Judaism for the first several hundred years. It says, and then many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold. Baseless hatred, or in Hebrew, sinat kinam, according to the rabbis, was the single most contributing factor to the destruction of both temples and other major calamities of the Jewish people that are commemorated on Tisha B'Av. Okay? So again, through our study in Acts several years ago, we know what it was like in Jerusalem during that time. As murderers, factions fighting factions, people murdering, being murdered. Yeshua says that the love of many grows cold because of their distance from Torah. We see that today. People's distance from the Bible. They just read the little parts that makes them feel good. They don't really get down into God's word to be taught. And because of that lack of Torah, they don't have the capacity to have God's love within them. When we live under the teachings of Torah, we learn to live as Yeshua lived. When we distance ourselves from the teachings of God, and that's when calamity strikes. We see that today in what everyone now calls the world a post-Christian world here in Western society. That means we're past being a Christian-influenced culture, and you can see that in the ruin that is happening all around. Okay. The abomination of desolation. Now, Yeshua gave his disciples very clear signs of what was going to occur. And when he referred to the Daniel prophecy, he was referring to Daniel's prophecies that we find in Daniel 9:2 and 17 through 18. And this is the Babylonian exile that Jeremiah described as a desolation that occurred in 586 BCE when the first temple was destroyed under Nebuchadnezzar. This happens in Jeremiah 25:11. When we get to Daniel's prophecy, he's realizing that the first desolation and the time frame that was prophesied is about over with, and that the temple, that they were going to be given a chance to go back and rebuild. Okay? So the second fulfillment of the abomination of desolation was when Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, and his desecration of the temple in 168, 167 or so BCE, that led to the Maccabean revolt. And we know that he sacrificed a pig on the altar and all of that. Daniel 11:31 says, his forces will rise up and profane the fortified temple. They will stop the daily offering and set up the abomination of desolation. And that's exactly what happened. Antiochus Epiphanes was hostile to Jewish worship and attempted to Hellenize or enforce the adoption of Greek culture and religion on the Jews in Judea. He outlawed all forms of Jewish worship, placed a Hellenized high priest over the temple who was sympathetic to his rule. I think he also outlawed circumcision.
He did.
Yeah. He eventually outlawed practice like circumcision, the biblical dietary laws, and Shabbat observance. So when Antiochus is on his military campaign in Egypt in 168 BC, a group of Jews, of course, revolts, and they go to war with him. He comes back to Jerusalem. He violently takes down this rebellion. He kills thousands of Jews, and he sells all the others into slavery. And in 167 BC, Antiochus erects a statue of the Greek god Zeus in the Jerusalem temple. Okay? So, and then again, he orders swine to be offered as sacrifices onto it, desecrating the entire holy place, which fulfills Daniel's prophecy. Okay? So these acts, yes, they were loathsome. They were detestable to the Jewish people. And this was the second fulfillment of this abomination of desolation. Again, prophecy is in cycles. It can recur and recur. Of course, Daniel speaks about these three times. The third fulfillment of the abomination of desolation occurred in AD 70, obviously, when the Roman armies under Titus sacked the city of Jerusalem. The battle raged for 3 weeks. Many of the structures adjoining the temple were burnt or on fire, but on the morning of the 9th of Av, the temple itself was still intact. Now, according to Josephus, Titus did not want the temple burned because he felt like a standing temple but a vanquished temple would reflect more on Rome's glory than total destruction. But it was a Roman soldier acting on his own who threw a torch into the building and started the fire that burned it down. Now, according to Chabad.org, before long, the temple was engulfed in flames. The Jews frantically tried to stop the fire, but were unsuccessful. In despair, many Jews threw themselves into the flames. The Roman soldiers rushed into the melee. Romans and Jews were crowded together, and their dead bodies fell on top of each other. The sound of screaming filled the air, and the floor of the temple was covered with bodies, and blood streamed down the steps. At this time, the Romans brought idols into the temple, offering sacrifices to these idols, and they took the golden vessels of the temple, and they killed everyone they found. So before the fire consumes the temple completely, Titus himself enters the Holy of Holies and performed a bunch of detestable acts, according. So the still surviving Jews are watching all of this as the temple is burned down to its foundations. It burnt well into the next day. Now, of course, we know that we still have the retaining wall on the western side of the Temple Mount, and that's the western wall that stands today in Jerusalem. But this was the third desolation that occurred, abomination of desolation that occurred. So when you see this is Yeshua's words. So when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and I've got that underlined, we'll get into that in a moment. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the roof must not go back down to take what is in his house, and the one in the field must not turn back to get his coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your escape will not happen in winter or on Shabbat. For then there will be great trouble, such as has not happened since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. And unless those days were cut short, no one would be delivered, but for the sake of the chosen, those days will be cut short. Now, a lot of times people will take this and say, this is speaking about end of days, but it's not. It's talking about when Jerusalem falls. So let's look a little bit at this little parenthetical, let the reader understand, that's added by the writer of Matthew. This is a phrase that we see here and in Revelation. Now that one phrase makes you pause and makes you say, okay, am I understanding things right? You know, it says, let the reader understand. Let's go back and reread everything so you know that what's going on. And this addition is to draw your attention to the imagery that's in the text. Okay? So first, it would appear that this gospel is written before the destruction of the temple. This editorial direction by the writer has two purposes. One, to confuse an outsider, anyone who was not in the know of Jewish prophecy and text, a follower of the way, wasn't a Jewish versed in the Torah or the prophets. It was to confuse them, and two, to make a clear allusion to what is going to happen, where those that were in the know would understand immediately what's being talked about, okay? So why the subterfuge? I mean, why do we have to give coded messages? So remember, we're talking first century Rome. Jerusalem is already a hotbed of seething, rolling hostilities. The Romans are seeing this anti-Roman sentiment in the least little thing, all right? It's another reason why the rabbis were so uptight about any kind of little thing that could make the Romans mad. I'm not giving them clearance. I'm just saying I can understand their political deals is let's not make Rome mad. We've got to contain things so that Rome doesn't kill us all. Well, that didn't happen. But the followers of Yeshua are seen as rebels. They're considered anti-government because of their Jewish identity before Yeshua's crucifixion, but especially so after his death and resurrection, because they will not bow down or offer cult offerings to Caesar or anybody else, okay? They're hated by the Jewish hierarchy because they see them as rebels that are causing unrest, okay? And causing Rome to be hostile to them. Not only that, but the side note also tells the people who understand the directive that there's no delay for what is about to occur within this generation. It's going to happen. Be ready. Yeshua uses some highly charged emotional language here, but it's no different than any other prophetic language used in the Hebrew Bible. Remember, all prophecy centers around Israel and Jerusalem. They are the center of everything that God is doing throughout history. Players of other nations are only there for God's purposes, whether that's to deliver judgment or to be conquered because of their extraordinary sin. But the Bible doesn't consider the nations key players, okay? Everything in the Bible is focused on Israel, all right? So we have to keep that in mind. America is not in the Bible, all right?
How hard to try to fit it in.
When we come to faith in Yeshua, we join ourselves to Israel, okay? So we become part of the focus of those prophecies too, all right? But no other nation matters in the grand scheme of things. Not America, Europe, Arab nations, not Africa, not any other country. They are supporting cast only. They are not the main actors. So when he uses this kind of language, for then there will be great trouble such as has not happened since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. And unless those days were cut short, no one would be delivered. But for the sake of the chosen, those days will be cut short. He is referencing prophetic material the disciples are already familiar with to paint a picture of what is coming. Again, we come back to what we talked about at first. Hebrew is a pictorial language. He is painting a picture in their heads with what he is saying. So we come to Joel 2:2. Let me get over here. There we go. So Joel 2:2 says, "For the day of Adonai is coming, it's upon us, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick fog. A great and mighty horde is spreading the blackness over the mountains. There has never been anything like it, nor will there ever be again, not even after the years of many generations." He's telling them, you're fixing to be wiped out. This is the judgment that's fixing to come on Israel right now. Okay. And this trying to explain things with pictures and words. Y'all know I'm a Trekkie, at least I think you do. So there was a Star Trek episode that was really interesting, and it made me think about how Yeshua uses his words. So Picard and the Enterprise, they encounter this alien race, And they've got the universal translators, but for some reason, even though they're hearing the words, neither side is understanding each other, okay? So the alien captain beams Picard down to a hostile planet, and he goes down there too, all right? The reason, and the reason that they do this is because he's trying to get him in a position where they can try to iron out why they can't understand each other. He really wants to be, they want to have a
Conversation.
right, a conversation. Thank you. The problem is the alien speaks in metaphors, okay? While Picard speaks in English, which is nouns, verbs, this, whatever, other. The alien culture uses stories to speak, to give ideas. And a lot of times Hebrew is the same way. Hebrew uses stories to make a point, okay? So this alien can't understand Picard. Picard can't understand him. And so in an attempt to break that language barrier, when they beam down to this hostile planet, the alien has a knife that he gives to Picard, and he says, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. And Picard goes, what? What? And Picard's thinking, this guy wants to fight me. He wants us to fight, I guess. But then he realizes there's this other hostile alien on the planet. And he realizes that what the captain is trying to do is make them comrades in a common goal where they can try to start understanding each other and learning each other. I look at that and I can say, we can apply that kind of thought process to Scripture, because Scripture speaks a lot of times in metaphor. It speaks a lot of times in word pictures. It does not necessarily mean, say, is the sun going to be darkened? Are the stars going to fall out of the sky? Maybe so. But what is happening is it's alluding back to a prophecy that we see in the Hebrew Bible. And this is what Yeshua is trying to tell them is fixing to happen. You're fixing to go through destruction. So they know that this prophecy over here speaks of destruction. He says what the prophecy says. It's the same way when he hung on the cross. When he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? That was his last messianic confession, I guess you could say. Because that goes back to Psalm 22, and these people would have known Psalm 22 was a messianic psalm, and it said everything that was happening to Yeshua at that time. And when he voiced those words, you can be sure that those people standing in front of him, immediately they thought of Psalm 22.
So they should have recognized him as Messiah at that point.
At that point, yes. A Roman soldier did.
Right, that's right.
A Roman soldier did.
Okay.
And
I'm sure others also.
Right. So it is a hard concept for us in a Western culture to get, because we have a linear conveyance of thoughts and ideas. We have sentences. We don't think in pictures. But if we don't learn to think in pictures, sometimes we can misread Scripture. And so we have to kind of be careful with that. So at that time, after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. This goes back to Joel 2:10, which reads, Before them land quakes, heaven trembles, sun and moon become dark, stars withdraw their brightness. Now remember, we have near and we have far prophecies. This one is a both and prophecy. It pertains to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, as well as the end of days before Messiah. And this particular prophecy that Yeshua says here is what segues from the Olivet Discourse being about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple into an end of days continuation of what will happen at the end of days. So he uses this particular prophecy to go from present day, what's fixing to happen, to this is what the messianic return, what's going to be going on before then. So that's what we'll be getting into next week, is the prophecies that pertain to end of days in this particular discussion. And, oh God.